Welcome, everyone. Is this on? Yes? Can you hear me? Great. Terrific. I'm Debra Raskin. I'm president of the New York City Bar Association, and I am beyond delighted to welcome all of you here tonight. Oftentimes, when people do introductions, they say they're honored to introduce so-and-so. I am so beyond honored. I can't even talk about it. To be on a dais with not one legend, that's not enough. We got two, okay? These are women who have taught us how to work, who have taught us how to fight, who have taught us how to live, and who have taught us to use the last dirty word in polite society, have taught us how to age. They are amazing. I would like to thank our distinguished lecturer, Gloria Steinem, for being here tonight. Again, it's such an honor, and like all of you, I am looking forward to her remarks, and Justice Ginsburg will introduce her shortly. It's my privilege to introduce Justice Ginsburg and to tell all of you that this is a lecture in a series that we are honored to use Justice Ginsburg's name for and to celebrate her groundbreaking contributions to the advancement of women's rights and of people's rights, her achievements as a lawyer, a law professor, and a judge. This is the 13th Ginsburg Lecture, and Justice Ginsburg has been involved since the beginning with the selection of lecturers and other participation, and we greatly appreciate your continued involvement. The City Bar has worked hard over the years to eliminate gender bias in the laws, in the courts, and in our profession. And for any of you who aren't members, I'd encourage you, there's a membership table out there, and go for it after we're done, okay? In our efforts, we're building on the foundation that Justice Ginsburg and Gloria Steinem have helped to found for us, their groundbreaking achievements in the area of women's rights, where many of us, all of us, would not be here today without those efforts. Justice Ginsburg has long been a strong voice for justice, gender equity, and civil rights. And you know the story. After finishing top among her class at Cornell University, she attended Harvard Law School, where she was one of only 9 women in the graduating class in '59. And then she clerked for Judge Edmund Palmieri of the Southern District, and in 1963 became only the second woman to join the faculty at Rutgers Law School. Later at Columbia Law School, she became the first tenured woman on the faculty, founded the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, and argued many cases before the Supreme Court, challenging sexual stereotypes and other discrimination. And a little plug for the City Bar, she was on our executive committee from 1974 to 1978. Yay. Prior to her appointment on the Supreme Court, she served from 1980 to 93 in the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to invite Justice Ginsburg to the podium to introduce our distinguished speaker. I'll be back at the end for questions and answers.
Thank you. Please be seated. I thank Madam President for that introduction. And like all of you, I have been looking forward to tonight with great joy because our speaker, Gloria Steinem, is among humans the least self-regarding, the most caring and giving. I vividly remember the day when I opened New York Magazine and found the first issue of Ms. Magazine inside. Gloria's bright mind, brave heart, and unflagging energy inspired that venture and so much else that, borrowing words from her friend Marlo Thomas, freed girls and boys to be you and me. Gloria has rightly been called, now for about a half century, the very face of feminism, the image of the women's liberation movement. Why her face more than any other? Well, she is uncommonly beautiful. But that's not the reason why. Gail Collins, in a tribute to Gloria at age 80, identified the trait that distinguishes Gloria from others whose celebrity status draws crowds. It is her gift for empathy. When Gloria is the center of attention, she holds no megaphone. She's almost always listening. Like my dear colleague Sandra Day O'Connor, Gloria spends much of her time in the air, traveling to places round the globe that are not the world's best garden spots, places where her voice may do some good. Sandra is famous for her 8 a.m. aerobics class. She initiated that class, which I have not yet made, being a night person. But that's the way she stays fit. Gloria says she stays in shape just running around airports and cities. Skilled in the art of persuasion, she captivates audiences by gently leading them her way. One example among thousands. Sometime back in the 1970s, Gloria and I attended a Second Circuit Judicial Conference in Buck Hill Falls, Pennsylvania. Remember? Our topic, in a debate with sociologist Lionel Tiger and Fordham Law School professor Whalen, the topic, should we or should we not have an equal rights amendment in our Constitution? The audience was scarcely of one mind at the start, but when Gloria finished, the vote for the ERA would have been nearly unanimous. For her unrelenting efforts to make our country and world a safer, opportunity-filled, happier place for girls and women, please join me in a rousing Brava, Gloria. I'm going to sit down so I can hear you.
It's kind of scary up here, I have to say. I can't imagine anyone else on earth who I would be more proud to be in the room with than Ruth Ginsburg. She is the standard of courage and intellect and kindness and heart. It's why it's scary. You know, can you imagine following Ruth Ginsburg? Actually, I think, though, that I have some things to say about her that, because she and I are pretty much the same age, might be less well known than how extraordinary she has been on the court. As just one instance, when she was the head of the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, which you have heard, she also initiated a reproductive rights project and took on the racist practices of involuntary sterilization of women and girls, especially African American women and girls, and especially in the South. Now, I only know this, I've never seen it written up actually, I only know this because I was an aide to her aide, Brenda Feigen, traveling through the South, helping to do interviews. And they included the great voting rights advocate, Fannie Lou Hamer. And Fannie Lou had been brave enough to come forward and to say what had happened to her when she went into a hospital for entirely different reasons. That practice was protested and stopped in many cases because Ruth understood that reproductive freedom really meant reproductive freedom. She also stands up for herself, which I think is interesting because some of us find it easier to fight for others than we do for ourselves. And I kind of remember when Dalton School called her with some question about her son, Ben, and she said, you know, he does have two parents. And hopefully they called Marty. Also, she didn't just vote for marriage equality on the court. She personally performed the marriage ceremony for two men friends. And she did so much of this when it was the hardest. I got a glimpse of how difficult it really was because I got an odd invitation from the Harvard Law Review banquet in 1971 to be their first female speaker. I said, that makes no sense whatsoever. Ask Ruth Ginsburg. She was in your first class of women. And I soon discovered that they didn't want to ask her because she knew where the bodies were buried. So I said okay, because clearly they were not about to ask her. But fortunately, all of the current women students, which were not that many, told me where the bodies were buried. And so I gave the only protested speech in a banquet room at the Harvard Law Review. And they told me how the men's room at the law school just had faculty above it. And the guy who should have been teaching the EEOC didn't know what it was. You can see why it was protested. Fortunately, the women students had just said to me, you will speak and we will tell you what to say. So it all worked out. In a way, the image of Ruth I cherish the most is the one I didn't see for myself, but was described for me. Ruth riding horseback in Colorado with a Western saddle, even though she was used to an Eastern one, galloping wildly, hair flying, loving it. Ruth is a whole person, and it's really saying something to say that her heart is as great as her mind. When others on the court or in Congress vote on an issue, I bet we always say to each other, well, did they vote right or wrong, right? Ruth is the one person about whom I think we all feel, if she voted that way, it is right. If she says something should go back to Congress, it should. If she says that it should have been the Equal Protection Clause, not privacy, she's right, right? So having said all that, you know, you can see why it's hard. Actually, I do recall going to speak about the ERA at the Second Circuit. That was very hard. But I did discover that judges were actual human beings. It was a very important moment in my life. It did shorten my life to try to do it, but it was now, for tonight, I've been going back and forth between two subjects, two V's, you might say, violence and voting, because I think both are in a stage of crisis, absolute crisis. So let's take them in order here. First, by violence, I mean violence against females. Not because it is more important than violence against males, but because it is even more prevalent and normalized, and also because it should be easier to cure since it's so rarely retaliatory or even in self-defense. Here's the bad news. For the first time in recorded history, violence against females is so great that females are no longer half the human race. The world sex ratio is now 101.3 males to 100 females. I think we should know that, but somehow we don't always know that. That's because of female infanticide, suicide, maternal mortality, domestic violence, the misuse of abortion for sex selection, sex trafficking, female genital mutilation, honor killings, all are on the increase or continuing to add to a terrible total. And that's now not even counting the greater vulnerability of women to AIDS and the increased sexual use of girl children by men who see them as insurance against AIDS, and many, many other outrages. Before we assume that this is only happening over there, somewhere else, and not here, here's a fact. Domestic violence is an epidemic here. According to FBI statistics, if you add up all the women murdered by their husbands or boyfriends since 9/11, and then you add up all the Americans killed in 9/11, in Afghanistan, or both wars in Iraq, more American women have been murdered by their husbands and boyfriends in the same period of time. Yet we hear a lot more about foreign terrorism than about domestic terrorism. I think if we didn't actually know in our own country, for instance, that the average age of entry into prostitution is about 12, and that the average life of a prostituted person, maybe boys and men too, we don't know, is less than the average life of a first lieutenant in wartime, that we should know, and we have to begin to really look where we are here at home, as well as to look elsewhere. But in this country, there are still about 5 million more females than males. Actually, that's largely because of deaths attributable to the, quote, masculine, unquote, role. Violence, stress, guns, sports, tension-related diseases, and so on are all killing men. It's part of the reason we know that feminism is good for everybody. And as I always say to audiences of only men, feminism has several years of extra life to offer you. Who else can make that offer? The worldwide gender imbalance, however, is real, very real. And it is not only hard on females, but also on males who become what are called bare branches. That is, without families, without wives, often without jobs themselves in many parts of the world. They become a prime source of petty crime, and as we are now seeing, of recruits for terrorism. Obviously, each human being's death or suffering is a tragedy, and each one of us is irreplaceable. But some deaths, all deaths, also set off a chain reaction of cause and effect. And that's especially true of female deaths. Because these deaths are so much of the violence in the world, because violence against females is the major part of the violence, and because it is normalized by gender roles, because it is normalized by what is wrongly called masculine and feminine. We now can prove, as is brilliantly done in a book called Sex and World Peace by Valerie Hudson and other scholars, which I commend to you if you haven't seen it. It was published in 2012 by Columbia University Press. What they show by looking at every major country in the world is that the best indicator of whether a nation will be violent within itself or whether it will be willing to use military violence against another nation is actually not poverty, not access to natural resources, not religion, or even degree of democracy. It is violence against females. That is what we experience earliest, perhaps even in our own families. It is the most likely to be considered natural or inevitable, and it deeply, deeply normalizes in us the idea of subject-object, leader-follower, dominant-passive, violent victim, because we started out with masculine, feminine assumptions to one degree or another. It normalizes all other violence. We come to think it is inevitable. And just in case we too have fallen for the idea that these roles are inevitable, let's remember that for most of human history, languages didn't even have gendered pronouns of he or she, he and she. From Cherokee to Bengali, people were people. What a concept. I always wonder if that is not why some languages are called romance languages. They give gender to tables, chairs, knives, forks, and so on. At least we don't do that. And we see it, if we can't see it in our everyday life to which we are so accustomed, we are certainly treated to many extreme lessons. We have only to look at Hitler's Germany to see the conscious polarization of masculine and feminine. As the National Socialists made clear, and Hitler said, quote, "It must be considered as reprehensible conduct to refrain from giving healthy children to the nation," unquote. And among his first official acts, perhaps by some account his first official act, was to padlock the family planning clinics and declare abortion a crime against the state. He was elected, and let's remember he was elected on a low voter turnout. We get to the vote later on. Okay. To restore masculinity to the fatherland and to make clear that healthy, he was talking about healthy children. By unhealthy, he of course meant Jews, Gypsies, and Africans, and those would be taken care of another way. But it was definitely the duty of Aryan women to have as many children as possible. He also, of course, punished lesbians and homosexual men by having to wear a pink triangle, as Jews had to wear a yellow star. In their case, it was for practicing non-procreative sex. The truth is, it's all about reproduction. If we didn't have wombs, we'd be fine. It's all about reproduction and who controls it. And by controlling reproduction, that means controlling women, and that, of course, is the source of the gender roles. As we know, too, where there is racism, all women are more in danger because women's bodies must be isolated or exploited to keep racism going in the long run. The women of the ruling group are supposed to have more children, and to make sure those children are pure, those women are sexually restricted. The women of the subordinate groups are either sexually exploited, like Fannie Lou Hamer's grandmother, who had 22 children, mostly by rape, in order to produce cheap labor. And when more labor isn't needed, they are kept from reproducing, like our beloved Fannie Lou. Obviously, reproductive freedom is the baseline of all freedoms for women. And because it is also the cause of the gender roles, it is the baseline of peace and equality for all of us. It is the biggest element, of course, in our in women's health, life expectancy, education, and ability to work outside the home. And it's so clear that racism and sexism are intertwined that I hope we say once and for all that they can only be uprooted together. It is not possible to be a feminist without being anti-racist. It is not possible to eradicate racism without also dealing with sexism. Patriarchy serves racism as a political system. It is a political system which maintains control of reproduction and therefore women's bodies. It puts that question in the hands of men. From the cult of virginity to the suppression of birth control and the criminalization of abortion, it is all about control of reproduction. You know, kids on campus sometimes ask me why the same groups are against lesbians and birth control. This seems odd to them. And on the face of it, it is. But actually, it makes sense because they are against any non-procreative sex. How often have we heard from our very political religions, which are really, sometimes I think religion is politics in the sky that you're not supposed to talk about, right? Very different from spirituality. How often have we heard that the only okay form of sexuality is that which ends or could end in reproduction, from which gays and lesbians and all women have suffered. We also might ask why the same groups declare right now, I'm not so sure about this one, but have you noticed that the same groups declare the fertilized egg to be a person and corporations to be a person? I think it's patriarchy plus the economic need for a labor force. They may not be thinking about it, but it's kind of spooky, you know, that they're all the same groups. To declare the fertilized egg or embryo a person does effectively nationalize women's bodies throughout all of our childbearing years by establishing a direct relationship between the state and the fertilized egg. There could be no more clear form of control. And it's already happening, actually. Pregnant women who have endangered themselves in one way or another are being imprisoned, not helped, instead imprisoned for endangering the fetus. Or take Boko Haram in Nigeria and the kidnapping of schoolgirls. It would have made a lot more economic sense for Boko Haram to kidnap important people for ransom, but they kidnap the one thing they don't have, wombs, the one thing that would allow them to continue. So what can you and I do? Well, I feel foolish with this brilliant group here because so many of you are already doing it, but let me just remind us. We can help make reproductive freedom a fundamental human right and therefore untangle this or take out the basis of the hierarchy. It should be as basic as as freedom of speech. We can refute the idea that what happens to men is political and what happens to women is cultural. No, it's just a way of saying you can't change what happens to women. Of course it's political, and we can change it. You can start every course or discussion on economics with reproduction, not production. I have yet to see, maybe I just don't know them, you can tell me, but I've yet to see one economics course that starts with reproduction, and it is so much more important, but it's just assumed. And I think, you know, we're clearly doing this in many ways. The use, relatively new use of Title IX to prosecute bodily invasion and to say that, you know, to be in danger in that way has something to do with your ability to be educated, that's great. I mean, this, you know, part of all of this, it's a step forward. But we have, in general, I would say, as a non-lawyer, you can tell me, that it's more reliable to, that property invasion is more reliably prosecuted than bodily invasion. Right? So perhaps what we need is a new principle that is even over reproductive freedom and protects men as well as women, which is maybe we could call bodily integrity. The power of the state stops at our skins. Yes, we can be imprisoned, but we cannot have our bodies invaded, male or female. In this era of pressure on everything from organ transplants to surrogacy, maybe we need a new legal principle called bodily integrity. Too often, a man's home is his castle, but a woman's body is not her own. As in the Hobby Lobby case, which Ruth wrote about so brilliantly, corporate rights exceed the human right to reproductive freedom. If there is a big global issue on which we in the room can press and contribute anything, it is the worldwide reduction of violence against females as a core goal of our foreign policy. It should be, given its outcome, its demonstrable outcome in every major country in the world, it should be a factor in our foreign policy. Instead, what happens is it would be nice principle. Well, it would be nice if women were more equal in Afghanistan, but it's not important, right? And many of our officials have said specifically that women's rights have nothing to do with nationalism, peace conferences, peace processes, all kinds of things. We could, for instance, actually put some teeth into UN Resolution 1325. I bet there are people in this room who fought very hard for that resolution, saying that women should be part of every peace process. And we have the principle, but it is on paper only. It is not enacted. This is not, I keep wanting to say, because this is so misunderstood, it is not about biology. I'm very grateful to Margaret Thatcher and Sarah Palin for proving that it is not about biology. It is about socialization, right? And it is about simple fairness. But women, in fact, are way, way, way less likely to have our masculinity to prove. That's why a peace in Ireland and the peace in Liberia, in both cases, thought to be hopeless for decades. In both cases, they were made possible by women working together on opposite sides outside the government, and they did what was supposed to be impossible. And there are national and local forms of this linkage that we in this room can really affect. For instance, in our current pain over racially motivated violence, whether it's by private citizens or our police, domestic violence is a predictor of the need to control other people. Before George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin to death in Florida, he was arrested for domestic violence. It wasn't even admissible in his trial. Had his domestic violence been stopped, maybe Trayvon Martin might still be alive, we don't know. Since his trial, he's been arrested 3 more times for violence against women. Before the bombing of the Boston Marathon, the bomber had been arrested for abusing his girlfriend. A study of hundreds of thousands of violent offenders in Washington state concluded that a felony domestic violence conviction is the most accurate predictor of the commission of future violent crimes. More than half of 93 mass shootings of people who the so-called senseless shootings of just going in and murdering people in a school, in a theater, and so on, more than half of those 93 mass shootings in the US began with an intimate murder. First, they murdered someone in their household or a girlfriend. Yet more than 35 states don't even prohibit people convicted of domestic violence or under a restraining order from buying and owning a gun. And what about the cops themselves? The National Center for Women in Policing reported 2 studies showing that 40% of police officers' families experience domestic violence, in contrast to 10% of families in the general population. I don't know of a study showing that individual cops who have been brutal and/or racist on the job have also been violent at home. But if it's not true, it would be the only case in which it isn't true. How can they be exempt, right? So shouldn't we be screening, asking the question, taking it seriously, discussing it? What we also know from a study by the Police Foundation is that female officers, again, not because of biology and not that there aren't also violent women, there are, but female officers tended to be more effective than males in diffusing and avoiding violence. As an ex-cop named Carol Armstrong, who perhaps you saw on television, said while demonstrating against our police here in New York, she herself was an ex-cop, she said, quote, "I arrested men bigger than Eric Garner, and I never killed them. How come a 100-pound woman can arrest men and not kill them? How come 10 police cannot arrest a man without killing him," unquote. Look at the profile of those who abuse their families. They are rigid, controlling, and entitled and aggrieved. Now look at the profile of those who commit public violence, from random shootings to terrorism. They are rigid, controlling, entitled, and aggrieved. They didn't invent this impossible, controlling, masculine role. They got born with it too, but they got addicted to it. Isn't it time we started connecting the dots, making the connections between violence in the home and violence in the world? Isn't it time we finally understand we're never going to have peaceful and democratic societies until we have peaceful and democratic families? Isn't it time we stop manufacturing the drug from Boys Don't Cry, which is the beginning of a masculine drug, right, to the need to dominate, control, and be sexually conquering of women as a part of masculinity? Isn't it time that we finally began to understand that human beings are linked, we are not ranked? Now, I'm a little worried about my time, but I did have a coda here on voting. So, it's okay? All right. So here goes, okay. Because I think this is so important, because the vote plus citizen activism is the only way we make lasting change. You know, change can come from the top, and it's helpful, but it's not organic. Laws can be on paper. We don't use them unless it comes from us. So let's think about activism and the vote. And let's remember that the voting booth is the one place on earth where the most powerful and the least powerful are equal. Yet, in the United States, we are 59th in the world's democracies, 59th for voter turnout. We are at our worst, I might add, in state and local elections. Most Americans have no idea who their state legislators are. And that has allowed state legislators, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, to be controlled by the economic interests they regulate. They can also redistrict themselves into perpetuity, including in Congress, which is why the House is always more conservative. You can't redistrict a state, right? More conservative than the Senate and less representative of public opinion polls. Now, and we should be aware of this, some states are trying to distribute electoral votes. I mean, the vote for president, those electoral, that's the last instance of direct popular voting that we have. And they are trying to manipulate that by distributing electoral votes by congressional district. And they have already manipulated the congressional districts, right? So, and I don't have to tell this audience how many efforts are being made through identification, moving the location of polls, all kinds of efforts to make it more difficult to vote, especially for people of color, especially for the poor, and also for students. It's probably already impossible to confirm anyone like Ruth Ginsburg, who really does reflect the majority belief of Americans in public opinion polls. Anyone who criticizes Ruth for not leaving while Obama is still in office is living on another planet. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for staying on the court. But here I have this is my little closing saga here, to encourage us to vote and do whatever we can to increase the turnout and to pay attention to our state legislatures and our lower bodies as well. For the Supreme Court appointments and violence against women and foreign policy and everything else, we have to do this. So here's my story. In the 1980s, I campaigned for Harriet Woods. Some of us here remember Harriet Woods, who was running for the US Senate from Missouri. She was neck and neck with John Danforth, the incumbent, who was the heir to the Ralston-Purina fortune, a former attorney general, and a former Episcopalian priest. She was running against the whole patriarchy in one person. The reason he won was only a last-minute spurt of attacks that Harriet didn't have the money to answer. It was so much about money, and only money, that his narrow victory inspired the creation of Emily's List. It was just over 1% of the vote by which he won. And even so, she, who was a pro-choice Democrat in what's Missouri is supposed to be an anti-choice state, she still won the most conservative district there, which is called Little Dixie, and she won it anyway. But because St. Louis was awash in paid media attacks against her, she lost by way less than 2% of the vote. When Danforth returned to Washington, he took with him a new staff member, an African-American conservative, a rare African-American conservative, who had been a lawyer for Monsanto, the agrochemical giant that gave us Agent Orange, genetically engineered seeds, and much more. Actually, Danforth got him that job too at Monsanto. They seemed to have a mysterious bond as conservatives who had prepared to be priests. As you may have guessed, that Monsanto lawyer's name was Clarence Thomas. Okay, now remember, for want of a nail, the horseshoe was lost. For want of a horseshoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the battle. Remember that? Okay. This parable should be the mantra of everybody who thinks his or her vote doesn't matter. Here's why. If Harriet Woods hadn't been defeated by very few votes, Danforth wouldn't have returned as U.S. Senator. If Danforth hadn't been senator, Clarence Thomas wouldn't have gone with him to Washington. If Thomas hadn't been in Washington, he wouldn't have been appointed by the first President Bush to head and to disempower the class action of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, or to sit briefly on the D.C. Court of Appeals. If Thomas hadn't been groomed by those with those credentials, he couldn't have been nominated for the Supreme Court by President Bush. Also, if Thomas hadn't had the fierce and single-minded support of Danforth, who accompanied Thomas on 60, count them, 60 visits to individual senators on the Judiciary Committee in order to lobby for him, he would have been unlikely to be approved. If Clarence Thomas hadn't been on the Supreme Court, he wouldn't have probably supplied, I know this can't be, depends who would have been in his place, but he wouldn't have supplied the one vote margin that halted the Florida court-ordered recount. If there had been a recount, Al Gore, not George W. Bush, would have been president. That was concluded by a post-election examination of all the uncounted ballots commissioned by 12 major news organizations. It was absolutely clear that Gore won that election. If George W. Bush had not been president, there would not have been the biggest transfer of wealth into private hands in the history of this nation, or falsified evidence to justify invading oil-rich Iraq. If Al Gore had been president, global warming would have been taken seriously. If, sorry. If Bush hadn't been president, we wouldn't have had the disbelief in, and a second optional war in Iraq, and a high level of disbelief in global warming, and public schools with abstinence-only education enforced by federal funding that helped give us the highest rate of unwanted pregnancy in the developed world, which we now have. If Bush hadn't been president, we wouldn't have had an executive order giving billions in tax dollars, nobody's ever really counted it, to faith-based centers of right-wing political power, or the global gag rule that deprived poor countries of US foreign aid if they offered abortion or even abortion referrals even with their own money, or corporate profiteering on privatized wars abroad as well as privatized prisons at home, or a higher percentage of the US population in prison than in any other country in the world, or corporate CEOs whose salaries have gone from 30 times that of the average worker before the right-wing backlash took over Washington to an average now of 1,000 times the average worker, or an unregulated financial industry that led to a worldwide economic meltdown and an even greater polarization of human beings and nations into rich and poor, or the turning of terrorism from a cause for global unity into a deeper global division, and so much more. So, the art of acting effectively is acting as if everything we do matters, no matter how big, no matter how small. In truth, we don't know which of our acts in the present will shape the future. What we have to do is behave as if each one of our acts will.
I think we're probably all speechless after that eloquence, but I think we have time for a couple questions. I think there's a mic over there. So any questions? Or actually, we've had it all answered.
No, we need their
Answers? Questions? Please.
Good evening. My name is Ingrid Buson-Hall. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and for pushing us to be more active. My question is just on that, given that I and many women in this room have walked the road that you and Justice Ginsburg and so many other women paved for us, where do you think we are, and are we being sufficiently vocal given all the work that remains to be done?
Just a little question like that, right? Sort of describe the universe and give 2 examples. I don't know, we are wherever we feel we are when we look in the mirror, you know? I mean, the whole country is going from the 22nd century back to the 17th century. It sort of depends. And that's why I think, I mean, I noticed that on campuses, kids will say, or older students will say, what should we do? And I always say, do not worry about what you should do. Do anything you can. Do whatever you can. And I think each of us kind of, you know, knows the answer to that. And it's comforting to me To know, I mean, I have worked so hard to prepare testimony in Congress, and it meant nothing. And on the other hand, I have said something casual to somebody, say, a banker who said, well, what could she do for the women's movement? I said, well, you could start a credit union, because actually, credit unions really work better usually for the average person. And I went back, she had the biggest credit union in her state. Who knew, So in a general way, if you can generalize, I suppose we have the model of the suffragist and abolitionist movement, right? And that took a century to gain a legal identity as human beings and citizens. Now we're struggling for equality, not just identity. So I would say it takes at least a century, and we're probably, I don't know, I'm guessing, but something like halfway into it. We've gone through the consciousness-raising stage, although new issues come up all the time, transgender, all kinds of new issues, come up all the time. But in general, we've kind of, on race and sex, had a substantial consciousness-raising, so there's majority support. But we haven't changed the structures, and also because we have majority support, we have a backlash. We've had a backlash really since, the 80s, really. And nowhere is it written that the backlash won't win just because it's a minority. I mean, they've taken over one of our two great parties, the Republican Party. Richard Nixon, Rockefeller, everybody supported the ERA, all those they were pro-choice. They couldn't get through the primaries now because of who controls the machinery of the Republican Party. So, we've made a lot of progress. We have a big backlash. And the answer is not blowing in the wind. We are the wind. This is what Bella Abzug always used to say, don't put your finger up to the wind, become the wind.
Other questions?
Or answers.
Okay. Answers? Well, the question has the answer.
For Ruth.
Please.
Thank you very much for your talk, Gloria. Here's a sort of oddball question. Time was when women played a really heavy role in propagating the system that oppressed us. Is it your take that that's all gone?
Mm-hmm. No, because internalized oppression, as the psychologists say, is deep. And what's this, a great Ghanaian novelist who wrote 2,000 Seasons, who always says, seeing people going against their own hearts and interests is the great tragedy of all time. However, most women don't have, people used to say to us, women are their own worst enemies. I always said, are you kidding? We don't have the power to be our own worst enemies. No, if you look at the polls, or if you think about our lives, there's enormous amounts of unity, and there is majority support in the polls for every single issue. I think we're still a little dependent on approval, so it's not like we're, for the most part, going against other women, but we aren't going as far as we could. And if we need one thing more than any other, I would say it's groups to talk to support each other. We're communal creatures, we can't do it by ourselves.
Thank you.
Maybe one last answer or question.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for your remarks. And I was wondering if you think that fighting dress codes in high schools would have any real impact on gender equality.
Yes, absolutely. If we can't control our own bodies, are you kidding? No, and I see, people do the most extraordinary things. Like boys who are sympathetic will get dressed up in skirts and and go to high school and help girls who were trying to wear jeans. Actually, there were a group of students sitting in my living room just last year talking about this exact thing. Nothing is unimportant. Everything is a microcosm of everything else. At a minimum, you're practicing to make even more. And actually, especially in private schools, I notice, dress codes are really quite severe and quite, how shall I say, quite restricting and quite divisive, because anything that divides us into groups of birth is a problem.
Oh, I guess we got one more.
Sorry. Thank you for being here. I remember reading your book in college and being so in love with you and the idea of going undercover and doing this whole expose and just being such a hero to women. So thank you, and thank you, Justice Ginsburg, because you're also one of my heroes. But my question is, especially in consideration of your discussion of voting, and when I was in college, and I'm sure many of us were, I was involved with one of those get out the vote. And even now in law school, I try to encourage friends to vote. But we're faced with so much apathy and people who just don't really feel like they have the time or the effort, or they're so preoccupied with looking for a job and looking to do well in school. How do we bring that kind of passion back to it? How do we get people, especially young people who who are going to be moving into positions where they might be considering running for office or in a position to make a difference, really? How do we bring that passion back?
Well, I think, just from being on campuses, which I am a lot, I would say the greater danger is the state legislative attempts to limit the vote, because to make identification difficult. But it takes whatever your version of, for want of a nail is, which, universities have a lot of influence in the state and congressional districts in which they are. Picking out issues that the vote affects and organizing around those issues, and make it a group occasion. In some high schools, when they register to vote for the first time, they all go in a group and make it a party. And this is, it's like a whole, so we need to show its purpose, make it communal. We're communal animals, and make it exciting and fun and serious at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this lovely evening, this brilliant evening. Justice Ginsburg, thank you so much. We're inspired. Go vote.